Chuck Norris couldn't or wouldn't do. The 86-year-old, long deemed invincible, has died suddenly, leaving his legion of fans in shock.
9 days before he died, an 86-year-old man posted a video of himself sparring under the Hawaiian sun. He looked steady on his feet, still throwing clean combinations, still smiling at the camera like a man who had nowhere else he'd rather be. 9 days later, that same man was gone, and the family he left behind had to say goodbye to someone the internet had spent a decade joking was too tough to die at all. This is the story of what Chuck Norris actually built in 70 years of getting up after every fall, and what happens to $70 million when the man who earned it is no longer around to spend it. For nearly a decade, Chuck Norris had been killed online more times than most people can count. A viral post said he died in a car crash. A wave of pandemic-era rumors insisted he hadn't survived COVID. Every single time, he was very much alive, usually laughing the story off or simply ignoring it altogether. Because that's what a man does when he spent his whole career being the punchline of jokes about his own indestructibility. So when word actually started to spread in March of 2026, plenty of people assumed it was another hoax. It wasn't. Norris was hospitalized in Hawaii after a sudden medical emergency, and within a day, his family confirmed that he had passed away at the age of 86. The circumstances were kept private, and the family statement made clear that they weren't interested in turning his final moments into a headline. What they wanted people to know instead was simple. He had been surrounded by the people who loved him, and he had been at peace. The statement itself was short, but it was written with a kind of care that made it stand out from the usual celebrity press release. The family didn't lean on his box office numbers or his martial arts titles. They thanked the public not for watching his films, but for loving him. That distinction says something about who Chuck Norris was underneath the memes and the roundhouse kicks. A man whose family wanted the world to remember the person, not just the performance. Tributes poured in almost immediately. Political figures who had backed him publicly for years posted messages calling him tough, genuine, and one of a kind. Television executives who had clashed with him in courtrooms over unpaid profits, of all people, issued warm statements praising his legacy. It was an unusual kind of unity for a man whose politics had often put him at odds with parts of the entertainment industry that ultimately still respected what he'd accomplished. But once the tribute settled, a different question started circulating in entertainment and finance coverage. What did Chuck Norris actually leave behind? And who was going to get it? The widely reported figure, tracked by outlets that specialize in celebrity wealth and cited by multiple entertainment and finance publications, put his net worth at roughly $70 million at the time of his death. That number by itself doesn't tell you much. Plenty of actors from his era ended up with less, and plenty ended up with far more despite doing far less work. What makes Norris's fortune interesting isn't the total. It's the path it took to get there, a path built less on lucky breaks, and more on decades of grinding, diversifying, and occasionally suing people who tried to shortchange him. Very little of that $70 million was ever a mystery. Unlike some Hollywood fortunes built on vague investment portfolios or unclear business ventures, most of Norris's wealth can be traced back to specific documented sources. Film salaries from a career that spanned dozens of movies, a per-episode paycheck from 9 seasons of network television, a nearly 30-year endorsement partnership that made him a fixture in American living rooms long after his last movie wrapped, a bottled water company built almost by accident on his own ranch, and the multi-million-dollar tail end of a legal fight with one of the biggest networks in the country. None of it came easily, and almost none of it came without him getting his hands dirty in the business side of the entertainment industry, something a lot of action stars of his generation never bothered to learn. His estate reportedly includes the sprawling Lone Wolf Ranch in Navasota, Texas, a property covering roughly 1,000 acres that had been the family's full-time home since Norris largely stepped back from Hollywood in the early 2010s. It includes a vacation property on the Hawaiian island of Kauai, the very place where he was hospitalized and later passed away, a home that had become a favorite retreat for him and his wife over the years. It includes a water bottling company built on that same Texas ranch after workers accidentally struck an ancient underground water source while drilling. And it includes decades of royalties from films, television syndication deals, book sales, and one of the longest-running celebrity fitness endorsements in television history. No will has been made public, and there's no indication that one needs to be for the public to understand roughly how things will unfold. Texas operates under community property law, which generally means that a surviving spouse is entitled to half of any property acquired during the marriage, with the rest typically passing to any children. Norris had 5 children across 2 marriages and one relationship that, for nearly 3 decades, almost nobody outside his closest circle knew existed. Multiple reports following his death indicated that discussions among the family about how the estate would be divided had reportedly been straightforward, with sources describing a long-standing, mutual understanding that his wealth would go to the people closest to him, without disputes over the details. If you want to understand how a martial artist turned action star ended up with a diversified, multi-million-dollar portfolio instead of just a big house and a garage full of cars, the Lone Wolf Ranch is a good place to start. Norris and his wife Gina O'Kelly made the roughly 1,000-acre property in Navasota, Texas their full-time home after he largely stepped away from a leading man's schedule in Hollywood. It wasn't meant to be a business. It was meant to be a place to raise their children away from the noise of the industry that had made him famous. Then, in the early 2010s, something unplanned happened. Workers drilling on the property for water struck what turned out to be an ancient underground aquifer, a natural reserve of water that had been sitting beneath the ranch for thousands of years, protected by a layer of volcanic rock. What started as a practical discovery turned into a business opportunity. By the mid-2010s, Norris and his wife had founded a bottled water company built directly on that source, eventually developing production capable of turning out hundreds of bottles a minute and distributing across the country. Gina took on the role of CEO and, according to reporting on the business, retained a controlling ownership stake, which means the company's leadership and direction stays firmly in her hands regardless of how the rest of his estate gets divided among the family. Alongside the ranch and the water company, set one of the most durable endorsement deals in the history of American television, a fitness equipment partnership that ran for close to 30 years and reportedly sold millions of units internationally. It's a kind of deal that rarely gets discussed with the same reverence as a blockbuster movie role, but it quietly generated more sustained income than most of his films combined, precisely because it never stopped airing. Long after Norris had stepped back from major film roles, that infomercial was still running somewhere in the world, still selling equipment, still putting money in the bank on a near-monthly basis. Layer on top of that the royalties, syndication payments, and licensing income tied to a television career that reached more than 100 countries, and you start to understand why financial writers describe his fortune as one of the more earned totals in Hollywood. It wasn't built on a single lucky script or a single viral moment. It was built the same way he built his martial arts career decades earlier. One discipline stacked on top of another, over and over, for years. Long before any of that existed, there was a shy, undersized kid in Ryan, Oklahoma, who by his own later description didn't consider himself especially confident or especially capable of much of anything. Carlos Ray Norris was born in March of 1940 into a household that moved constantly in search of steady work, first through Oklahoma, then Kansas, and eventually to California. His mother worked hard, often alone, to hold the family together, while his father struggled with alcohol and was frequently absent for long stretches. Norris later wrote candidly about how unpredictable that made his childhood, describing a house that felt calmer when his father wasn't around than when he was. He graduated high school in California in the late 1950s as an unremarkable, non-athletic teenager, the kind of kid nobody in his graduating class would have picked out as a future action star. That same year, he enlisted in the United States Air Force and married his high school girlfriend, Diane Holchek. The Air Force sent him to South Korea, and it was there, almost by accident, that the direction of his entire life changed. He wandered into a martial arts class on the air base, and something clicked. He began training obsessively, putting in hours almost every night under the instruction of a Korean master, and within a little over a year, he had earned his black belt. He later described that accomplishment as the first time in his life he had genuinely achieved something difficult entirely on his own effort. It's a small detail, but it matters, because it explains almost everything that came afterward. Once a person internalizes the idea that they're capable of hard things, they tend to spend the rest of their life looking for harder things to attempt. When his military service ended in the early 1960s, he initially tried to become a police officer and found himself on a waiting list. While he waited, he began teaching karate out of his parents' backyard. And within a few years, that informal teaching had grown into a chain of martial arts schools across Southern California, attracting a number of well-known students from the entertainment world. He became a repeat national karate champion during this stretch, building a reputation in competitive martial arts circles well before most of the country had any idea who he was. It was at a martial arts tournament in New York in the late 1960s that Norris crossed paths with a rising martial artist and actor named Bruce Lee. The two struck up a friendship and began training together regularly, trading ideas about fighting philosophy and technique in a way that pushed both of them to improve. When Lee later got the chance to direct a film in Rome and needed someone to play the antagonist in a climactic fight sequence, he called on his friend from the backyard training sessions. That film became one of the most influential martial arts movies ever made, produced on a shoestring budget and eventually earning an enormous return relative to its cost. Norris became internationally recognizable off the back of a film in which his character loses the fight, a strange kind of fame built on being defeated on screen by a man he would later describe as the greatest martial artist he'd ever known. After Lee's unexpected death in 1973, Norris remained close with his family, and by several accounts spent time with Lee's young son in the years that followed, sharing stories about his father. It was actually another of Norris's karate students, the actor Steve McQueen, who eventually pushed him toward acting as a career rather than a hobby. McQueen reportedly told him plainly that he already had the screen presence. He just needed to learn the craft. Norris took the advice seriously, enrolled in acting classes, and slowly built a career through a string of independently produced action films in the 1970s and early 1980s. Some of those early films made money on shoestring budgets, specifically because Norris and his producers took the unusual step of renting out theaters themselves when studios wouldn't distribute the pictures on their own. By the early 1990s, he had appeared in more than 20 films and had built a loyal audience, but he still hadn't landed the role that would turn him from a working action star into a permanent piece of American pop culture. That role arrived in 1993, when a television series about a modern-day Texas Ranger who solved crime with martial arts and a strong moral compass premiered on network television. The show almost didn't survive its first season. The original production company behind it went bankrupt before more than a handful of episodes had even been finished, and the whole project came within a hair's breadth of being canceled outright. What saved it, according to numerous retrospectives on the show's history, were surprisingly strong premiere ratings that convinced the network to find new production partners and keep alive. What followed was 9 seasons and more than 200 episodes, made notable in television history as one of the first primetime network dramas filmed entirely in Texas rather than on a studio backlit elsewhere. Norris exercised significant creative control over the show through his own production company, insisted on storylines that reflected his personal values, brought his brother on board as a producer, and even performed the show's theme song himself. The network reportedly credited the Norris family with keeping the production consistently on schedule and on budget across its entire run, a rarity in an industry known for both slipping. His contract for the show reportedly included a substantial per-episode fee, along with a meaningful percentage of the profits generated by the series, and across more than 200 episodes. His acting fees alone are estimated to have run into the tens of millions of dollars. The real financial engine, though, turned out to be syndication. The show was eventually licensed to cable networks for large per-episode fees and ultimately aired in more than 100 countries. And court filings from a later legal dispute revealed that the franchise's total revenue across its lifespan exceeded $500 million. That legal dispute is where the story takes a sharper turn. In 2018, Norris filed suit against the network and its studio partner, alleging that they owed him tens of millions of dollars in profits he was contractually entitled to, but had never been paid. His legal team argued that the companies had structured later